So we're at the 2009 ETHOS conference that's mostly concerned with biomass-based cooking, but I thought it would be interesting, there would be people here that are interested in water pasteurization, possibly combined with biomass cooking. So this is a presentation that I gave about an hour ago, and this is a repeat performance, so to speak. So let's continue. So the purpose of this talk the purpose of giving this talk before the biomass cooking community was to mostly stimulate their thinking about how we might do water pasteurization and cooking at the same time, or perhaps come up with fuel-based water pasteurization methods. So again, the purpose is to really stimulate thinking here rather than to present information. Next. So as most people know, the lack of clean drinking water is a huge health problem. When I first started in solar water pasteurization in the early 1990s, I think we were looking at 3 million deaths per year, so things have improved somewhat, but it's still a huge burden of disease and suffering and death. Next. There are many ways to provide clean drinking water, and I won't go through all these here. Some of the methods are appropriate for large scale, some for small scale, some for large or small scale, so there are lots of options, but mostly we'll be talking about pasteurization here. Next. So pasteurization is the heating of water to a temperature sufficient to kill all disease-causing organisms, or pathogens, including viruses, germs, and parasites. The minimum temperature is about 65 degrees C, and the minimum time is about 4 to 6 minutes. It is not necessary to boil the water, as everyone seems to think. Microbiologists have studied this problem for decades, and they tell us that the hepatitis A virus is the most heat-resistant pathogen in drinking water, which is killed by about 65 degrees C in 4 to 6 minutes, or higher temperatures for a shorter time, or lower temperatures for a longer time. Pasteurization has the unique advantage that it can be scaled down with a great decrease in cost. So in other words, if you have only a little bit of money, you can develop a small pasteurization system which will provide a small amount of clean drinking water, let's say for a person or for a family. Next. So the question that arises obviously is, if you only need to get to 65 degrees C, why are there literally hundreds of books which say that you have to boil the water? And I had always suspected the answer, but I finally just a couple weeks ago saw it in writing for the first time from a recent UNICEF document that basically the boiling is as they say, a visual indicator that a high temperature has been achieved. Indeed, how do you know when water has reached 65 degrees? Next. And the answer is, in my back pocket, a water pasteurization indicator. Borrowing some ideas from others, I developed the first successful water pasteurization indicator in 1992 when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. I did it at the request of Solar Cookers International, which is not too far from Berkeley. So that was available. This has been available since 1992. The WAPI is currently mass-produced and available for sale through Solar Cookers International. It's quite reusable. It costs less than $2 to build it, although they may charge you more than that. And most importantly, it continues to indicate even after the water has cooled down. So it is truly an indicator, it's not a thermometer. Next. So the question is, how does it work? What you see on the screen is the same as what I'm holding in my hand. It's a sealed plastic tube filled with soybean wax, or you can also use petroleum wax as well, that melts at a temperature just above the pasteurization temperature. And there's a system of strings and weights such that when it drops into the water from above, it will sit in the water rather like this thing is sitting here at the bottom of the water vessel, but sort of floating up. And if you put it in the water such that the fat is in the high end of the tube, which is not real clear, but you can kind of see that there's something in this end of the tube. If you come back later and pull it out of the water and the fat is now in the low end of the tube, then you know that it melted and therefore that the pasteurization temperature was reached. And if the water has since cooled down, that's fine. Once it has registered, you would reuse it just by flipping it over and then sliding this thing to the other end of the string. It's reusable many, many times. It doesn't last forever, but it lasts like 2 years, 4 years, something like that. This one is maybe 15 years old, and it now doesn't melt at 67 degrees C anymore. It's much higher than that. So the Whoppy does not last indefinitely, but it does last for a good long time. Next. So that's the Whoppy. There are basically two methods of pasteurizing water, one of which you might call a batch method, where a vessel of water is heated all at once with a Whoppy in the coolest part of the water, usually the bottom. Next. And there, in the 1990s, a bunch of people, including me, developed a bunch of methods for using solar energy to pasteurize water. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them just listed in words. And then next, here's a photograph of one of them. This was an aqua pack that can pasteurize up to maybe 5 liters per day. Next. And here is a solar puddle, which is a layer of water maybe 1 or 2 inches thick, surrounded top and bottom by plastic sheets that form an insulating barrier. And I'm leaving out a few of the details. But the solar puddle can pasteurize maybe 25 to 50 liters per day in a unit of about this size. So it's basically a puddle in a greenhouse. You might think of it as a puddle in a greenhouse. So that's solar water pasteurization. Next. The second basic method of pasteurizing water is what you could call a flow-through system, which is more complicated, but it has some advantages. You would use a thermostatic valve, which opens at a temperature of a somewhat higher pasteurization temperature. In other words, if you heat to 72 C for 15 seconds, then you get pasteurization, and that's better. The flow-through units can be a little trickier. They're more complicated, and if you have a fast flow of water, you're not guaranteed of getting that 4 to 6 minute residence time. So we typically go higher temperatures for shorter times with flow-through systems. With the thermostatic valve, it's an automated process, which is much easier, but the big advantage to flow-through systems is that you can recycle the heat of the outgoing water to preheat the incoming water. Next. Now we'll say visually what I just said in words. You can take cold, clean water from dirty water from a dirty water vessel, run it through a heat exchanger where it picks up a large amount of heat as it goes, then run it into the solar collector, which could be a solar box cooker or many other things. Thermostatic valve would open at the pasteurization temperature, and then the hot, clean water would flow out, giving up most of its heat in the heat exchanger and then eventually into the clean water reservoir. A well-designed heat exchanger can increase the water throughput about 4-fold, typically for maybe a, 50% increase in cost, maybe not even that much. So it's a very good trade-off of a little bit of extra money for a lot of extra water. Obviously, the heat exchanger needs to be carefully built so that there's no leakage of the dirty water to the clean water, but that should be a relatively easy process if you're careful and if you design it right. Next, here's a commercially available flow-through unit. This pasteurizes up to maybe 200 gallons per day in optimal weather conditions. It has about a 4-foot by 10-foot solar collector, as I recall, and I would assume that the heat exchanger is in this big box here. It's a very well-engineered system that works very well. It's not cheap, however, and smaller flow-through systems are also possible. Next. So finally, getting back to our cook stove conference here, what does all this have to do with cook stoves? And this is the part of the talk where I'm trying to stimulate people's thinking. Pasteurization works no matter what the source of heat, whether it's the sun or whether it's fuel or whether it's, somebody rubbing their hands together. It would be hard to generate a lot of heat that way, but the point being, no matter what the source of heat, pasteurization works. And a stove is a heat generator that works day or night or whatever the weather. So let's move on. Here is basically it's a fancy kettle. It holds about 6 liters of water, and it has a tube running up through the middle through which the hot gases flow, and then they flow out there. So I did a test on this week at the Andreatta Research Lab in Oregon, where we pasteurized 6 liters of water with an efficiency of about 18%, as I recall. Let's go to the next slide. Here's the actual test. So the disadvantage, however, is that you have to put it on a stove, So you can either cook with the stove or pasteurize with the stove, but not at the same time. And again, it took, I don't remember how many minutes, but it easily pasteurized 6 liters of water. Next. So what if you could combine cooking with pasteurizing? Particularly using heat that would normally be wasted or poorly used. You could perhaps pasteurize 5 to 10 liters per meal, which should be enough for a family of 5 or 6. The previous device that I showed you is mass-produced, and I'm told it costs about $4.10, so it should be possible to design a water vessel that would pasteurize water at the same time as cooking for some similar amount of money. You know, the device that I showed you was reasonably complicated, and it would be about the same level of complexity as a water pasteurizer. So here are a couple ideas. Next. Not a great graphic, but I kind of threw this talk together quickly. But what we've got here is some type of stove which has a chimney, and there are a lot of different types of stoves that have chimneys, with some sort of water vessel built into a section of the chimney wrapped around the chimney such that heat from the gases going up the chimney would go into the water. You'd have a fill spout and a wappy at the bottom underneath the fill spout, and you might have a drain spout as well, or something with which to get the water out. But not real complicated, but you could pasteurize a modest amount of water in the same time that you cooked a meal. Some preliminary calculations by myself show that this is, with some care, this is a workable idea. Next, here's another idea which, again, preliminary calculations show that this should be workable. This is a ring-shaped vessel that goes around the cooking pot such that hot gases which normally go away from the system now pass around the water vessel and hopefully give good heat transfer, and again you can pasteurize maybe 5 to 10 liters per meal. Again, a fill spout, a wappy here at the bottom, and again preliminary calculations say that this should give about the right energy balance. Next. Finally, could you use a flow-through system, adapt that to a cooking system? Yes, probably. Next, this is what's called, this is a little sketch of what's called an institutional pot. It's basically perhaps a cauldron, perhaps 2 feet in diameter and 2 feet deep, typically used to cook a meal for a school in, say, Africa, or perhaps for an orphanage. So it might have a capacity of 100 liters or so. You could possibly adapt this to make it into a flow-through water pasteurizer. A little more complicated than the batch processes, but you've got this as an option. It would take a little bit of work to balance out all the engineering in this, but again, this is just to stimulate your thinking rather than to present final ideas. Again, the heat exchanger is a central element to any flow-through system, and appropriate valves for safety. Probably you'd use a float valve and a thermostatic valve. With this system, you could not cook and pasteurize at the same time, but you could, however, let's say, pasteurize 200 liters in the morning, and then once that's done, just immediately, without starting a new fire, just start making your meal. So there are lots of different options here. Next. Finally, this is the last slide. Lots of different references for water pasteurization, particularly with regard to using solar energy. But at this conference, I'm trying to propose the ideas of cooking with biomass and pasteurizing at the same time. So again, the purpose of this was really to stimulate your thinking, stimulate the thinking of the people who saw the original presentation, and I hope I've done that. That's all.